Today we are going to talk about the concept of systemic inequality in Canada. Specifically, the idea that there is not simply one type of citizen in this country, but rather 6 distinct classes of citizen as enforced by Canadian law and the government, and in many cases, even the Constitution itself. I am stealing this idea of 6 classes of Canadian citizenship from a famous speech given by former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1992. It was a very famous speech back in the day. You can see in this book version, they describe it as the speech that rocked the country and stunned the entire nation. But it has been largely forgotten today, and I couldn't find it anywhere online, so I just scanned it and put it online myself. You can see the link in the thing below. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada for most of 1968 to 1984. Aside from perhaps Wilfrid Laurier, the 8th Prime Minister, he was undeniably the most consequential leader that Canada ever had. Trudeau had a fairly authoritarian style, and he didn't always come off as a man who was clearly motivated by ideas. Like many great men of history, a lot of what he did seemed primarily dictated by his own desire to effect grand change through his force of personality. However, what he always claimed to be his underlying philosophy was a liberalism of individual rights. That is to say, the philosophy that argues that the ideal form of government is one that affords the individual maximum personal freedom. The government should protect an individual's right to live his life as he sees fit, and not subject him to oppression on the basis of the arbitrary preferences of others. One of Trudeau's most famous quotes about his philosophy came in 1967 when he was Attorney General. He was spearheading an initiative to liberalize some of the Canadian social policies of that time, including laws prohibiting same-sex intercourse. And this was how he described what he was doing.
The view we take here is that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation.
When Trudeau became Prime Minister, however, he created a much more lasting monument to this doctrine of individual rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This was a new addition to the Canadian Constitution that declared, for the first time, that in Canada,
every individual is equal before and under the law, and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination.
Okay, now flash forward to 1992. Trudeau is now out of power, and the new Conservative administration of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney has proposed its own package of amendments to the Canadian Constitution, known as the Charlottetown Accord. And he's going to put them to a big national referendum. During the referendum campaign, Pierre Elliott Trudeau came out of retirement and gave a blistering speech telling Canadians to vote against the Charlottetown Accord. It was the speech that rocked the country. Trudeau accused Mulroney of trying to add a bunch of new collective rights to the Constitution, which he said would undermine Canadians' individual rights. Collective rights are when legal rights are given to some group of people who share common characteristics. And here is what Trudeau had to say about that in his speech.
When collective rights take precedence over individual freedoms, as we see in countries where ideology shapes the collectivity, where race, ethnic origin, language, and religion shape the collectivity, we see what can happen to the people who claim to live freely in such societies. When each citizen is not equal to all other citizens in the state, we are faced with a dictatorship, which arranges citizens in a hierarchy according to their beliefs.
Now, the Charlottetown Accord would have added collective rights to the Canadian Constitution through something known as the Canada Clause. The Canada Clause said that Canada was a country with certain fundamental characteristics in terms of what sort of specific people lived there and what those people specifically needed. And it said that in the future, judges could not rule Canadian laws unconstitutional simply because they violated individual rights. No, upholding the fundamental characteristics of Canada would instead have to be given equal weight or more weight as well. Trudeau said that in defining these fundamental characteristics of Canada, The Charlottetown Amendments created 6 different types of Canadian, some obviously more important than others. In other words, a hierarchy of citizens. Now, the Charlottetown reforms were ultimately voted down in the national referendum, but my argument would be that it was a false victory. I would argue that in the years since 1992, Canada still wound up being a country in which collective rights triumphed over individual rights in many circumstances, and that Canada has, in fact, become a country with 6 different types of citizens, all arranged in a hierarchy, just as Trudeau feared. All prime ministers since 1992 have been complicit in this to some degree, including, ironically enough, Trudeau's own son, Justin Trudeau. Though it's important to note that in many ways Pierre Elliott Trudeau was himself complicit as well. This is because, despite presenting himself as the great champion of individual rights, some of the language in his Charter of Rights and Freedoms wound up setting the foundation for the expansion of collective rights. Anyway, I would argue that the triumph of collective rights has been overall a generally negative thing for Canada. I think a hierarchy of citizens is a bad thing, since it can foster systemic inequalities between different types of Canadians, though I know that the left wing in Canada tends to disagree. So I'll just describe the facts as I see them, and you can tell me what you think at the end. So the first special class of Canadian that Pierre Elliott Trudeau warned against was the French Canadians of Quebec. The Canada Clause would have declared Quebec a distinct society, as defined by the fact that it has a French-speaking majority and a unique culture. In other words, this would have finally settled one of Canada's longest-running historical debates. What exactly is Quebec? Is it a diverse, democratic province like the other 9? Or is it some sort of special ethno-cultural enclave run by and for the French Canadians? Now, a lot of French Quebecers would say that Quebec has always been a unique ethno-cultural French enclave, even if that fact was never explicitly recognized by Canadian law. Certainly over the last few decades, the government of Quebec has become a lot more explicit in thinking about the province this way. The current government of Quebec, for instance, has been very open about its belief that the province's French majority should be forever able to dictate the culture and character of the province. So it has cut immigration and fought against the public use of non-French languages and passed prohibitions on the wearing of religious clothing that it considers incompatible with French-Canadian culture. And I guess all of this has been controversial to some degree. Like, I guess a lot of the Canadian left, including Justin Trudeau, is in theory opposed to a lot of what the Quebec government has been doing lately. But it's also not really treated as that big of a deal, because I would argue that much of the modern Canadian legal political establishment really buys into this idea that the French Quebecers enjoy a unique collective right to protect their unique culture, and if that means occasionally running roughshod over the individual rights of others, well, you can't make a beautiful French omelette without breaking a few eggs. The second special class of Canadian that Pierre Elliott Trudeau warned about was the Indigenous Canadians, although I would say he was quite hypocritical on this one. As we all know, when the Europeans conquered this continent, they uprooted and displaced the Indigenous First Nations who were initially living here. They classified them as this whole other category of person, the Indians, and eventually made them live separate and apart from the new civilization of Canada that was erected on their lands. This included isolating them in Indian reservations and residential schools, and more broadly, just making so-called status Indians live by different laws and under different political authorities than other Canadians. Pierre Elliott Trudeau came to power very opposed to this idea of treating Indigenous people as this whole other category of person. And in 1969, he proposed an ambitious plan for getting rid of their separate status in what became known as the White Paper of 1969. As his government put it at the time,
the legal and administrative discrimination in the treatment of Indian people has not given them an equal chance of success. It has exposed them to discrimination in the broadest and worst sense of the term, a discrimination that has profoundly affected their confidence that success can be theirs. Discrimination breeds discrimination by example, and the separateness of Indian people has affected the attitudes of other Canadians towards them.
Trudeau proposed abolishing much of Canada's existing Indian Affairs bureaucracy and instead suggested that the country move to some sort of new system in which Indigenous Canadians were governed by basically the same laws and institutions as other Canadians. Now, what exactly this meant in practice was always left a little bit vague, and in the end, Trudeau didn't even go through with it. In this book, he rather condescendingly says that the Indians were not ready for it. They were psyched out. A more honest summary would say that the Indians had come to appreciate the status quo, as bad as it might be in any number of ways, for at least being a system for protecting their collective rights as a distinct people. In any case, Pierre Elliott Trudeau ultimately ran hard in the other direction and explicitly put Aboriginal rights in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. All of the centuries-old infrastructure for dealing with Indigenous peoples, including the Indian reservations and the treaties, and the entire legal category of status Indians, gained constitutional basis for survival, and survives to this day. Today, the collective right most aggressively championed by Aboriginal leaders and the Government of Canada is this idea that Aboriginal people have a right to self-government independent of the rest of Canada. You might have heard of the recent protests led by the chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation of British Columbia. They said that they had the right to veto the construction of this big natural gas pipeline going through their asserted territories. And they said this despite the fact that there seemed to be considerable evidence that many individual members of the Wet'suwet'en Nation were actually in favor of the pipeline because of, jobs and so forth. And eventually, the Justin Trudeau administration settled with the chiefs. Going forward, there is supposedly going to be a lot more meaningful consultation about this sort of thing. Now, the fact that the protest was led by the chiefs was very significant because that gets to something that Pierre Elliott Trudeau specifically warned about, which is that collective rights usually just wind up being rights for governments. Since only a government can claim to speak on behalf of a collective group of people, collective rights inevitably make governments more powerful and individuals more helpless, even individuals within that same collective. And thus, just as pushing the collective rights of the French Quebecers has made the Quebec government more powerful, so too has pushing the collective rights of the Indigenous Canadians made the many, many Aboriginal governments of Canada more powerful as well. Critics argue that this focus on consolidating the Indigenous collective right to sovereign government, which can often be a very long and legally complicated process, too often comes at the expense of improving the individual circumstances of individual Indigenous men and women, not just in terms of economic issues like access to jobs, but more basic things too, like clean drinking water. The third special class of Canadian is the so-called official language minorities. That is the French Canadians who live outside of Quebec and the English Canadians who live inside of Quebec. This is another issue where Pierre Elliott Trudeau was fairly hypocritical. In 1969, Trudeau declared that Canada had two official languages, French and English. And then later, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms also declared that Canadians who spoke these languages had special language rights, including the right to receive government services in their language, particularly education. Now, obviously, modern-day Canada is a very diverse country with people speaking all sorts of different languages, but the concept of official languages means that the government does not care about all of them equally. The governments of Canada and Ontario, for instance, recently announced that they were going to pump $126 million into building a French language college in Toronto, despite the fact that there aren't that many French-speaking Torontonians. But since the French-speaking Torontonians are part of an official languages community, they have a collective right to receive certain government goodies that, say, the Italian Torontonians don't. In Quebec, meanwhile, there is this whole elaborate government-funded infrastructure based around defending the rights of English-speaking Quebecers in the face of their chauvinistic government. Now, you could easily argue that Anglo-Quebecers are not exactly the minority that is suffering the most in that province these days, but since they are part of an official language minority, they have a collective collective right to a level of government help that, say, the Muslim Quebecers do not. By the way, in his speech, Pierre Elliott Trudeau basically accepted this. He wasn't hypocritical enough to complain that official language minorities enjoyed collective rights, given that he was the architect of giving them those collective rights in the first place. No, his complaint was just that the collective rights of the official language minorities were slipping down the hierarchy a bit. I would also say, just as an aside, that Pierre Elliott Trudeau failed to anticipate how his official languages policy would give rise to another powerful collective rights community, the bilingual Canadians. I've already done a whole bunch of videos on this topic, so I won't belabor the point. But basically, the need to administer a state that does everything in two languages naturally privileges those Canadians who can speak those two languages, thereby creating a class of people with the collective right to run the national government forever. This is a useful theory when it comes to explaining, say, the lack of diversity on the Canadian Supreme Court. And on that note, the fourth class of Canadian are racial and ethnic minorities. Pierre Elliott Trudeau figured that these Canadians were destined to wind up fairly low on the pecking order. Canada is, in theory, interested in recognizing the equality of all Canadians, regardless of race or ethnicity, he said. But since we have already established 4 groups of Canadians with unique collective rights, the French Quebecers, the Anglo-Quebecers, the outside of Quebec French, and the Aboriginals, in practice, this means that ethnic minorities in Canada can only assert their individual rights to the degree they do not conflict with the collective rights of one of the higher order classes of Canadian. You can see this right now in the way that Canadian politicians have been talking about Black Lives Matter. They'll often feel the need to insert an explicit mention of Indigenous Canadians as well, even though that's not really the topic of conversation. The argument would be that Black Canadians exist outside of the dominant official institutionalized narrative of who has been victimized by Canadian history, which is generally dominated by the stories of these groups, and whose plight the modern Canadian state has been at least partially structured to redress. And this means that Canadian officialdom's ability to think or talk critically about the unique roots of anti-Black racism, including the practice of African slavery in Canada that all of these groups were complicit in to varying degrees, is very limited. Black Canadians, like other unofficialized racial and ethnic minority groups in Canada, lack a collective right to acknowledgement of their unique history and culture, and thus can only ever really be spoken of through analogies to one of the officially prioritized groups, in this case, the Indigenous Canadians. Check out this recent speech by NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, for example.
While we look to the States, this is not just an American issue. Here in Canada, we face anti-Black racism as well. Black people have died at the hands of police. We know that anti-Indigenous racism and deaths of Indigenous people at the hands of police is something far too common. So we have our own issues here in Canada, and we can't shy away from the anti-Black racism that exists.
Or how about this clip right from the beginning of the speech?
Bonjour, good morning.
Even though his speech was entirely in English, he had to insert that bonjour because the French Canadians have a collective right to acknowledgement as well. The Chinese Canadians didn't get a ni hao any more than the Jewish Canadians got an acknowledgement of anti-Semitism. Jagmeet Singh himself is an interesting case study of all of this. He is someone who doesn't easily fit into one of the higher order classes of Canadian and has seen his political career suffer as a result. For instance, it is often said that the fact that Singh wears a turban makes him very offensive to the cultural sensibilities of the French Quebecers, and this is the reason they voted massively against his party in the last election. That might strike you as extremely racist and awful, but it is also something that the Canadian left has had to sort of tread lightly around, including Singh himself. This is because they're all generally committed to the idea that the collective right of the French Quebecers to defend their culture should not be unduly undermined by outsiders. The fifth class of Canadian that the old man Trudeau was worried about is kind of complicated to explain and not really that interesting. It's basically this idea that you have different rights in Canada depending on which province you live in. As we've said, the constitutional changes that Trudeau opposed would have declared Quebec a distinct society, which by definition puts all of the citizens of the non-Quebec provinces into some other non-distinct category. In theory, this could have ramifications for Quebec's ability to establish different kinds of social programs than the other provinces. The proposed constitutional changes also affirmed that the governments of Canada's northern territories would never get equal representation in the Canadian Senate, nor be involved in any future constitutional amendments, unless all of the other provincial governments agreed to let that happen. But this wasn't really anything new, it was just making the status quo more explicit. People often ask me what is the difference between a Canadian province and a Canadian territory, and the only real answer is that residents of the territories lack access to these two very specific collective rights. Now, whether any citizens of the Northern Territories, as opposed to their politicians, feel particularly disadvantaged by their lack of access to these rights is an open question, which I guess is just more proof that collective rights always wind up being more about governments than individuals. And then finally, category 6 is just everyone else. These are the Canadians with no collective rights, just individual rights, which puts them in a subordinate position whenever the exercise of those rights comes into conflict with a group of more favored Canadians, which is to say some sort of government that is attempting to assert its collective right to uphold some sort of fundamental Canadian characteristic. There are a lot of Canadians on YouTube who do political commentary, but I have noticed that very few of them spend much time talking about Canadian issues, which is fine, I get it. Canadian issues are kind of boring and no one really cares. But I do think that this whole business of individual rights versus collective rights is an interesting one. So I am putting out a challenge to my fellow Canadian YouTubers, particularly those on the left. Is this a good system of rights we have in this country? Do you accept my premise that we are currently living in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's nightmare scenario, in which the collective rights of a few favored groups of Canadians possessing the supposed fundamental characteristics of Canada are allowed to triumph over the individual rights of others? Or is this maybe no big deal? I would really like to see some sort of dialogue happen on this issue. And for my viewers outside of Canada, here is a question for you. Can you think of any examples in which your country's laws or constitutions grant collective rights to certain groups in your society? And who represents those collective groups at the political level? And do you think the existence of these collective rights is a good or bad thing? I'm keen to see what you all got to say, and I will see you all next week.